Well, Activision have done it again. Yet another pay-to-win situation has arisen in Call of Duty Black Ops 4. Past that, we've got traditional actors getting more involved in games, Sean Murray being open about No Man's Sky, some slithery speech from Bethesda, plus a heck of a lot more. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Roundup, our Tuesday and Friday gaming news show where we get you filled in on all the most important headlines. Today we're going to kick it off with GameIndustry.biz interviewing Hello Games' Sean Murray about the No Man's Sky comeback story. Overall, it's just a pretty interesting bit of industry news, but the key takeaway here is that they pretty much get near AAA player numbers whenever they release their free updates, with active players overall in the millions for the monthly periods, and concurrent even hitting up to 100,000. How did this end up happening? Well, pretty much it seems scrappy indie crunch and self-sacrifice. That's something that tends to be a little bit more okay when it's a smaller team like Hello Games because of shared ownership in the project, with the the positive results of their efforts kind of fueling the desire to continue. At least it seems to have happened that way. In a way, you could say it's similar to the Epic situation where Fortnite is doing so well so they have to keep on feeding the beast, but unlike Epic, with the smaller Hello Games team, it seems to be a lot more sort of passion and, genuine people opting into it, driven rather than being dictated and mandated by management, maybe making it more acceptable in the eyes of many. He did say other things of interest, though, that he actually likes this stage that they're in of updating the game because they can just focus entirely on new features, and he attributes just a lot of their continued excitement to the community. They've got millions of players obviously waiting for updates based on the player numbers that they get, so they can keep a finger on that pulse, and that's resulted in a very player-focused approach to development that has worked out quite well for them. Now, given that we're inundated with live services and evolving games that are all trying to do that stuff, No Man's Sky might be an example of it working, but almost by accident, because notably, live service is not its business model. It has no business model past just shifting copies of the game. There's no cosmetics or seasons or anything like that, or battle passes. And when you look at, say, Anthem and Fallout 76, they're two major launch failures in this era of games, and I do wonder if they'll find it harder to make a comeback because of their big AAA teams having that reduced agility, plus all the downsides of having to work within a corporate structure, something which Hello Games seems to have been able to pretty much move past. Now, speaking of Fallout 76, Bethesda's Pete Hines was also interviewed by GameIndustry.biz, and largely on the same topic, the mistakes they've made and how they're going to learn from them. He spoke about how they're not the sort to call it quits, and that they're committed to 76, and when compared to Final Fantasy XIV, of course, a failed MMO that saw a total reboot under Yoshi P because the franchise's, basically its reputation, was on the line, so they felt like they had to really commit to a strong reboot, and Pete basically said that that definitely had a sort of a part to play in their thinking, what went on there. He goes as far as to say they are, quote, one of the most respected and decorated studios in the world, and that when they hit a roadblock, they persevere. He thinks that Fallout 76 was an ambitious project, and that they knew they were going to have trouble, and he went on to say that when they looked at the Fallout 76 social media updates and all the comments they were getting, that, nobody cares and the game was dead, that him and his team pretty much said to each other, well, we've seen this move before. Pete said that this was actually quite similar to the response of Elder Scrolls Online. That's a game that, of course, now is far better regarded than it was at launch, much like with, say, Final Fantasy XIV or No Man's Sky. Now, Pete said that the 76 team had to learn that lesson fresh, but that the company as a whole has spent a few rounds in the ring. So Hines pretty much said that they're going to use everything they've learned from ESO to guide the 76 team in creating a fantastic game. And you know what? If that works out, sure, fantastic. It would be better for Fallout players if 76 turned into a really good game. But it's not an excuse for the busted product that they sold people, and it's not an excuse for their handling of that situation. It seems like a bit of corporate arrogance. I would turn a lot of what Pete said back on him. With their ESO experience, they should have been able to dodge those problems, as saying that the 76 team had to learn those lessons fresh is essentially saying they can't learn from examples within their own company, which is pretty derogatory to them and hard to believe. So this is all fine in, Pete's world of after-the-fact rationalizations, but I really don't think they're owning up to what they did properly. Anyway, moving on, there is one extra article from GameIndustry.biz that's pretty interesting. This one is about actors in video games. So the director of God of War was at the Game Lab conference and he told some stories. It used to be that they could just find someone with a fitting voice for a character and just call it a day. But now, well, actors are truly actors, and with the advent of really good mocap tech, they're delivering full performances that are actually used in games. He said that it took 2 years to find an actor that worked for Kratos because they needed to find someone who not only would sound like Kratos, but also would match his build and actually be able to act him. He said that when they gave Chris Judge the role, he actually believed it was a movie, and the same goes for Danielle Bisutti, who played Freya. Apparently, she thought she was auditioning for Game of Thrones, and was very disappointed when she found out that wasn't the case, but you know what, I'm sure she's a bit less torn up about that one now. Barlog goes on to say that he's struggled with well-known actors before because they just don't want to do games, but I suppose it does seem like that is something that is changing. It does seem to be less the case now, as is apparent with the cast of Death Stranding and Squadron 42, I guess some of the David Cage stuff as well, you know, throw a bit of Willem Dafoe in there, as well as Cyberpunk 2077 getting huge positive coverage for it featuring Keanu Reeves. But I suppose it's a kind of weird situation. So Chris Judge, Kratos, right? He's from Stargate, that's where I know him from, but he's not a massive Hollywood A-lister with a really, really big draw. And sure, we all love Keanu as the internet's boyfriend, but that's because Keanu doesn't really feel like a Hollywood celeb to people. And I suppose once that sort of big money thing comes into games, it will be rather bizarre. And I suppose it's also going to be really quite bizarre for some of the business and the finances of games, because if you look at what actors end up charging for being in movies, like, you know, a Robert Downey Jr., that's a hell of a lot of money. But the thing is, with games, you know, sure, the actor will, an actor in a game will be a large part of that performance, sure, like Troy Baker in The Last of Us. Very, very important role. But yeah, there's also like a lot more in a game. It's because it's an interactive experience. There's the artists who are crafting that interactive experience. Now, that's not to take away from, say, you know, the QA testers or like the carpenters who are working on set for a movie. But I suppose they are slightly different products by their nature. And whenever you're getting into big Hollywood actors and what they will be charging with royalties and stuff like that, I do just wonder if the games industry is going to care that much. I mean, being real, Keanu's Keanu, but if it was Chris Pratt in a video game, I don't think people would care as much as he's a pretty popular guy. Then next, Twitch have announced something a bit controversial, subscriber streams. Now, these cannot currently be set for the tier 2 or tier 3 subs. Sub streams just by default are for all subs, and they can include VIPs and mods if the streamer chooses. Now, on the business model end, there's also a free preview for sub streams once a day per streamer. But basically, it's allowing for $5 a month exclusive stream content. And I think this is a very interesting one because, of course, I run a Patreon. That Patreon does have behind the scenes, but I think there are some differences. So the stuff that I do in Patreon, like I whip my phone out and I walk around the office. If I published that to this channel, it would tank this channel in terms of the YouTube algorithm and all that stuff. Plus, well, I think the thing with this, with optics, that's weird is, if you go to watch a Twitch streamer, right? So let's say, you know, I'm from World of Warcraft, so let's just say Asmongold. You go to watch Asmongold. I don't think he'd do this, but, you know, you go to watch him and you go to the same link that you always go to. It's his normal stream, but just that sometimes it's paid only. Right, that's what would make that feel a little bit strange. It's the same location, but it's now suddenly paywalled. Whereas with, say, people running a Patreon or something like that, it's very clearly off in another place. It's very clearly not regular content. So I think it's a pretty interesting thing in terms of optics, and why this has been particularly not that well received by audiences. Because yeah, if it's just you're watching a normal streamer playing their video game, and then they hit the sub only button and they're just continuing to play that video game, that feels a little bit, that just doesn't really feel that good. It feels like you're missing out on the experience. Whereas say, yeah, we do early access for our deep dive episodes. That's because they're not tied to the news, and that is an experience that everyone is going to get. We do our, you know, behind the scenes Patreon stuff, right, where I whip out my phone and show you my new camera or something like that. But, you know, that's pretty quick for me to make. That's not really the core content that people are subscribed for. Yet, if I was to do, say, an episode of the Roundup, if I was to do like half of an episode of the Roundup and then have the other half be paywalled, that would feel really bizarre. So a lot of this is going to be in how individual streamers actually implement it in their stream. But yeah, I mean, I can totally see why people are a bit suspicious of it. A lot of it just kind of will feel wrong because of how this is presented on Twitch and how people engage with Twitch. Then next, a fun little story over in China. There's been a little bit of a controversy. So MiHoYo, a Chinese mobile game developer who seem to make reasonable enough quality products, they're under fire for an open world RPG called Gangjin Impact. Now, some are saying that it's a blatant Breath of the Wild copy, and when you look at it, the visual style, the UI, and the execution of the open world all seem extremely inspired. And some of the mechanics are basically identical, although some other mechanics are definitely more inspired by, say, other Eastern RPGs. Basically, people are calling the developer a copycat, and the developer responded by saying that, yeah, they were inspired and they don't apologize for copying. They said they looked at plenty of games for inspiration and because they were new to that genre, and that they really liked Breath of the Wild. So they're using design elements, sure, but I suppose what I'd say is, has that not been the case in games for a very long time? Like, legally, it's not using Nintendo's IP, and the game does look distinct in some ways, but it absolutely is an interesting thing because it's not that well defined. You know, when is inspiration or homage actually just stealing? I mean, for my personal take, it's like, yeah, this does seem like it's a perfectly fine legal thing. The game does seem to be doing some of its own stuff. But I will say that it default makes me less interested in it because it's like, well, that's just an experience I've seen before. It doesn't seem like an interesting twist in that, and that is, I suppose, why such heavy inspiration is really maybe not the best thing to do. However, this could be a case of a Chinese game developer taking that and trying to make it for the Chinese market, where maybe Breath of the Wild wasn't that big, and that's kind of what's going on here, and it's never something they would expect to do well in Japan or the West. Really quite hard to tell. I'd love to know what you think about that sort of thing going on, like when a game is just skirting the line. And then next, it's back to our old favorite, Call of Duty Black Ops 4. Oh boy, this time they have added a thing called Blackjack Stashes to Blackout's time-limited game modes. Now, these stashes contain the black market weapons that the player already owns. Now, this means that if they've unlocked a weapon through the loot box system, which is called reserves, they'll be able to pick that weapon up in Blackout. Now, the reserves can be earned slowly, the reserve crates, through gameplay, or they can be purchased outright. So, yes, this actually does mean that in some Blackout modes, they now contain DLC weapons that you can only use if you've got them in loot boxes. Now, the implementation of this even stops players from picking the weapons up off the ground if they don't own it themselves, which is just so counter to really a battle royale game. Now, we can be pretty sure this did not come from the devs. Jason Schreier's recent Blops 4 expose explains that many of the developers that he spoke to feel the same way that players do, like Activision is on this never-ending quest for increased revenue, and that the developers just don't have much influence in the game they're actually making. So it really is quite a sad situation for the Treyarch staff, who got into the games industry, I imagine, because they love games, because they're passionate, yet they end up kind of being forced to work in stuff like this. Hopefully what happens is they get pissed off enough to the point where they feel like they can go indie and do something creative and interesting, though that said, if you've got a family to feed, that might not be the thing you'll do, and it might not be the wise thing to do. And I suppose the only other analysis to do is just that, yeah, it's more experimenting with business model from Activision. Is anyone surprised? No. And speaking of Activision, we have Blizzard's founder and ex-president Mike Morhaime talking about crunch. He said this, quote, "Blizzard has definitely evolved around crunch. In our early days, we crunched crazy hours to get the games done. I think if you're a small studio, you're living or dying by the success of your next project. It takes a lot of superhuman effort, or at least it did for us." And this kind of echoes some of the sentiments that Sean Murray with No Man's Sky relayed earlier, where small teams sometimes will feel like they need to give 110% to actually, be able to do it. Now, Morhaime, to his credit, does later say, this is not sustainable and we need to find better ways of working. And that absolutely is the case. He says there has been a lot of improvement in the industry lately, which really does raise some questions on how bad it used to be. Now, I think that crunch in today's industry seems to come from two places. Mismanagement is one, where we've seen many AAA studios making drastic creative changes on a whim and causing a lot of issues for developers because of that, like with the Blops story. And then for some older places, crunch seems to be a relic of a long gone time that the industry probably should be leaving behind. Now, over in the indie space, well, it's all about how a small team of people chooses to work together. Now, if you've got 4 people with ownership in a company like actual shares, then yeah, have at it. I mean, I own this channel. I have no problem working 60 or 70 or 80 hours a week in this channel because it's my own gig, and I've pretty much done that for 3 years straight. But I do think it's a very different kettle of fish whenever that's not the case, even in the indie sector, where crunch is often over-celebrated a bit. Then finally, on the topic of crunch, a quick note, because OpenCritic have recently floated the idea of displaying information relating to crunch and development conditions on the OpenCritic page for games, and that's pretty cool. They also have done good things for displaying monetization. So really, OpenCritic, I mean, they're better than Metacritic. Just go to OpenCritic instead. They're a pretty good bunch, it seems. And then finally, we've got a good story for our friends over in Germany, and that is that Wolfenstein Youngblood will get an uncensored release. Of course, a lot of iconography and things relating to that period of time, you can't really show them in Germany. There's like, well, it depends on the media and stuff like that. But essentially, that's just been a long-standing thing. And I think it's really important that history is not something that is side-skirted or, you know, sort of censored a little bit. Like, when you actually go back to a lot of the World War II stuff, a lot of the post-war German army accounts are actually like the memoirs of German generals. And you know, in of those things, they kind of do sanitize a lot of what the German army did. Now, the problem with that is that, well, a lot of it's kind of a little bit of lies and plays into some very interesting politics of the time. And whenever companies like, say, you know, DICE with Battlefield try to produce these like weird kind of censored versions, it's actually playing into a very, very troublesome sort of bit of revisionism that actually happened with a lot of those post-war accounts from the German generals that essentially whitewashed a lot of the bad stuff that the Wehrmacht did, and also sort of created the whole, you know, Wehraboo thing, which is a little bit odd. So yeah, it's nice to see that Wolfenstein's being able to do that. I think that's actually a good, you know, it's a good step forward. So you know, I commend all involved in making that decision happen. Anyway, that is it for this episode of the Roundup. A nice big chunky one for you to round off this week. And yeah, with that, our Valve Index just arrived. So I'm going to have to set that up. I'll see if we can ever make some content. I mean, it's mainly for the game dev studio, but yeah, there's an index here, and I'll mess around with it, and I'll probably relay your thoughts. At the very least, I'll do a segment in a future roundup talking about Boneworks, so if you're interested in that. Thank you very much for watching this video, and with that, I'll see you next time.